to the spring of 2018, Lois Riess was an energetic 50-something-year-old woman living within an hour of her hometown. But then she became known across the United States as something else, the killer grandma, and she was on the run. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. This week I'm going to cover a case that I came across while I was searching for articles on a different case, but where the people had similar names, and then I immediately pivoted to this one. I was surprised that I had never heard of it because it was big news at the time, but in my defense, in April of 2018, I had an 8-month-old baby and 5 other children, so I was probably just a little tired. But when I came across this case a few weeks ago, I was first interested in the fugitive angle and the way the police search for and find people in a digital world. So that's why I started to cover it. But then, as I watched various coverage on the case, I realized there is a lot of information worth talking about here. In addition to the coverage that happened at the time, there have been a lot of retrospectives done on this case. There is a 2-part documentary called I Am Not a Monster that we will talk about towards the end of the episode. There is a Dateline episode, an episode of Meet, Marry, Murder, and another one Targeted for Murder. That's another show I saw coverage of this case. It seems that all of these shows start in a different spot timeline-wise, but this is Crimeline, so let's walk through the chronology starting where? At the beginning of time. And this week, that means April of 1963, when David Riess was born in Rochester, Minnesota. Dave grew up with 3 siblings in a close-knit family, and everyone says the same thing about him. He was a funny guy with a big laugh that just took over. In the spring of 1982, 19-year-old Dave met 20-year-old Lois Riess at work, and the two started dating. But Dave had enlisted in the Navy, and 2 months after they started dating, the Navy sent him to San Diego. Rather than be separated, Lois followed him out there. Moving across the country to follow a man you just started dating sounds impulsive, but Lois was not necessarily wanting to stay in Minnesota with her family. Lois was the youngest of 5 children, and her life had been chaotic for most of her childhood. Her mother, Donna, had significant mental health issues. It's been reported she had bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. In part because of the stress of his wife's mental health issues, Lois's dad was more or less checked out. He made good money working at IBM, so they always had a roof over their head and food on the table, but according to Lois, he refused to spend much more money than that on his children or spend much time with them. Lois's mother, Donna, also had a severe hoarding disorder. One childhood friend of Lois's told the documentary I Am Not a Monster that Lois rarely had people over because of it. And the one time she went into the house, they had to climb over piles of stuff just to get to the stairs to get to the second floor. So Lois did not have people over much, and she didn't like to be home any more than she had to. She stayed with friends as much as she reasonably could, and she dropped out of school at 16 to start working. By the time she was 20, running off with a charming guy to get out of Minnesota probably sounded great. Dave and Lois ended up eloping in September of 1982, and about a year after that, they had a baby. And then they had 2 more children in the next few years. Dave and Lois's youngest son told Inside Edition in 2018 that as a mom, Lois always put them first. And Lois's friend told the documentary I Am Not a Monster that she also put Dave ahead of herself. He went to work and he enjoyed his hobbies, and while he was a loving father, the day-to-day household tasks were left to Lois. After Dave left active duty for the Navy Reserves, they moved back to Rochester, Minnesota, and settled in. Eventually, Dave and Lois were each running their own businesses. Dave had a bait shop, and Lois ran a home daycare. By all reports, they were both great at their jobs. Not everyone has the skill set to be self-employed, whether that's running a business with employees like at the bait shop, or even just a single-person home business like a daycare. But they definitely excelled. In 2005, with their children, by that point all young adults, Dave and Lois made a big life change. They left Rochester, Minnesota, population 120,000, and moved 50 minutes away to Blooming Prairie, population 1,900. The move was prompted by a business opportunity. A worm farm was up for sale, and Dave and a business partner bought it. The business would raise and sell waxworms to bait shops, just like the one Dave had in Rochester. And as a bonus, there was a house on the property that was the right size for Dave and Lois. Lois even eventually reopened her daycare out there. And then they quickly set about making friends. Dave and Lois both had big, outgoing personalities. They weren't one of those couples where one was the quiet one and the other was social. They were both so friendly and warm that they had a solid friend group in Blooming Prairie very quickly. They would go out to the bar or maybe the bowling alley to socialize. Dave got to know all the other people who liked fishing in the area because of his business, and he would even do a few tournaments as he could. People around them knew that their marriage wasn't perfect and that they had their spats, but for the most part, it never seemed to be outside of the norm for a couple that had been together since the 1980s. And they did a lot of things together. They had their own social lives and hobbies, of course, but they were just as likely to be at the bar or the bowling alley or even the casino together, even though Dave wasn't big on gambling. Lois would later say that what people saw from the outside was not the whole story. She would accuse Dave of abuse, primarily verbal, but occasionally physical. She said it started with him throwing things when he got angry, and then eventually he put his hands on her. And she said her children witnessed this and were aware of it, even if no one else was. Now, I was not able to confirm this through the public statements her children have made. One of them spoke with the media, and two of them eventually gave impact statements in court, and I did not see abuse in the home being addressed in any of those. I'm not saying it didn't happen or the kids didn't see it. I'm just saying they haven't confirmed Lois's claim publicly. One of Dave's nieces did an interview with the documentary, I Am Not a Monster, and she did not confirm or discount Lois's story. She seemed to leave room for the possibility it was true, even though she had never seen anything firsthand. The one part of Lois's story going into the spring of 2018 that can be confirmed as true is that she was overwhelmed. When she first started talking on the documentary I Am Not a Monster about how she took care of everyone else and never herself, I kind of bristled. I am familiar with people who martyr themselves rather than take accountability, and so I had to check myself for a second and put my knee-jerk reaction to the side and look at the facts. The truth was, Lois did take care of everyone else. To explain the extent of this, we have to talk about Lois's family of origin. Lois was the youngest of 5. Her oldest brother and one of her sisters weren't exactly in need of Lois's direct care, but 2 of her siblings did need assistance. Her sister Kim had serious health issues affecting her kidneys. She had 2 kidney transplants in her life, one as a child and one as an adult. And then, in her late 30s, Kim started exhibiting pretty significant psychiatric symptoms. A lot of sources say that she had bipolar and/or schizophrenia like her mother, but the documents shown on the documentary I Am Not a Monster indicate that this was actually Huntington's disease, and that does line up with the onset of symptoms. While bipolar disorder and schizophrenia tend to have a younger average age of onset, Huntington's disease usually has symptom onset after the age of 30, with the average age being in the late 30s, early 40s. This is a disease that causes the breakdown of nerve cells in the brain, so it isn't just mental health that is impacted. It affects physical movement and cognition as well. As such, Kim became disabled and eventually she was put under a conservatorship. Their mother, Donna, had died in 1998 and their father was declining in health by this point, so it was decided that Lois would be in charge of Kim's affairs in 2012 when guardianship and the conservatorship was established. Lois and Dave had Kim move in with them for a period of time, but that ended up being untenable. It is hard having another adult person live with you, but someone you have to take care of all the time is even harder. They ended up finding Kim another place to live and eventually moved her into an assisted living facility. Lois then moved their brother, who had been paralyzed in his younger years, into a place nearby as well. Keeping them close meant Lois could help more with errands and doctor's appointments and things like that. And then, in the same time period, their father's health went downhill even more as he aged, and Lois took on supervising his end-of-life care as well. She basically had 3 adults with various levels of disabilities that she felt responsible for, plus her husband, plus her own adult children. In April of 2014, Lois's father died and she was there to handle his estate. He had been retired for something like 30 years at that point, but he had been frugal, so he left behind enough money that his children would get a decent amount. You'd think, with 5 kids, they'd each get 20%. But that is not how he set it up, and Lois learned this when they read the will. In the documentary, it was put out there that he gave based on how much value he saw in his children, which is kind of a dark way to look at it. And maybe that is what happened. Or maybe he gave it to the ones he thought needed it more. I don't know. Regardless, he gave 3 of his children 25% plus certain spelled out assets, and he gave Lois 15% and her eldest brother got 10%. Lois, who had taken care of her father in his last days, had definitely expected more, but the amount she got was, according to her, a few $100,000. Except that math doesn't really hold from what I could tell. Because Kim was under a conservatorship, her annual financial reports are public record. She received $200,000 from her inheritance, which was a 25% share. So doing some math, or rather letting a calculator do the math for me, Lois would have gotten probably $125,000, which isn't nothing, but it's not a few $100,000. Regardless of the amount Lois got, we can say she blew the money. She had closed the daycare, so this inheritance was her income, and she used it to buy her husband a new truck. She bought machinery for the property, things for the house, she gave some to the kids, she got some fun toys and gadgets, and then she gambled the rest. Lois liked to gamble. She played blackjack and the slots, and as usually happens, she lost more than she won. But for someone who felt run down in her day-to-day life, the occasional win and also the friendliness of the people at her favorite casino meant Lois felt her best when she was at the casino. She used gambling as her escape from real life, and it moved from being a fun little getaway to an addiction. Lois spent and gambled away her inheritance. And then she started to do the same with her sister Kim's money, which she had control over as the conservator. Kim complained a few times about thinking money was missing, and in 2015, Adult Protective Services assigned a social worker to go over everything after an audit had showed there were some issues with the accounting. They found that there were a number of inappropriate payments in 2014 and 2015 from Kim's account, mostly going to Lois. There were times money was transferred from Kim's account into Lois's account and then immediately withdrawn at the casino. There were also large quote-unquote gifts given to Lois's kids coming straight out of Kim's account. It's not clear if they benefited from that money or if Lois used it on herself. It was late 2015 that this was really coming to light, and they were moving to remove Lois as the guardian of her sister. And according to the publicly available documents, they were also considering whether or not to press charges. Lois was completely overwhelmed, probably with shame, and almost certainly with concern over future embarrassment if this was all exposed. Like I said, these were public records. In a small town like Blooming Prairie, it would take all of 10 minutes to get it around town if Lois actually got arrested. So one day, in December of 2015, right as all of this was hitting the fan, Lois was home alone while Dave was out to lunch with a coworker. They got back to the property, and instead of going right to the worm farm like planned, Dave stopped at the house to use the bathroom. He walked in and found Lois unconscious and not breathing. Dave called 911 and performed CPR. Lois was life-flighted to a hospital in Rochester, and she woke up on life support, having overdosed. And because of a note she had left, they knew it was intentional. The National Council on Problem Gambling has gone through what studies there are out there on gambling and suicide and found that 1 out of every 5 individuals with a gambling disorder has attempted suicide. Lois was in the hospital for a few weeks and then returned home. But I wouldn't be here covering this if Lois got the help she needed or accepted the help that was offered at the time. This could have been a turning point, but it wasn't. Lois ended up not facing charges for allegedly stealing money from her sister's accounts because the authorities opted to handle this civilly instead. Because of the amount taken and because Lois didn't have a criminal past, even if they pressed charges, she would have probably only been given probation and ordered to pay restitution. Lois tried to justify her actions by saying that, yes, she paid herself, but it was for taking care of her sister, which she was allowed to do. She was reimbursing herself for her time and gas for taking Kim to the doctor and wherever else she needed to go. Sometimes she would buy something for Kim and then have Kim pay her back. And as for the money to her children, Lois said Kim had always been generous to them, so she didn't think anything of it. She basically had an answer for all of the missing money, and none of the answers were that she gambled it away. Lois's only concession was that she didn't do things properly and she didn't do the documentation correctly, but Adult Protective Services saw this differently. They saw this as theft. So they made a deal with Lois. No criminal charges, but she was not going to be the guardian anymore, and she had to reimburse her sister's accounts for what she took by the end of June 2016. Lois was able to pay off some of the debt by giving Kim an asset, and the rest of it, $38,000 was supposed to be paid by check. So Lois paid it, and then the check bounced. Lois did not have the money to make restitution, and the deal she made was rescinded. A few weeks after this bounced check, on July 24th, Dave reported Lois missing. He said he had gone out of town on the 22nd, and she wasn't home when he got back on the 23rd. He couldn't reach her because she left her phone behind, but he did note that she took her medications and some clothing. Given that Lois had attempted suicide 7 months earlier, and she had this large restitution payment to make that she wasn't able to make, Dave was afraid she was suicidal again. But the police said they didn't think so. She didn't leave a note this time, and why would she pack clothing if she wasn't planning on needing it? Lois did come home a few days later. She had told a friend that she had to get some space from Dave, so that friend let her stay in a family cabin. She told Dave she just went out of town to visit someone, no big deal. But since she came back, she had to deal with that money. The deal was void, and they were moving forward with the civil case with additional fees and money tacked on. And the way Lois dealt with this was to avoid it. She didn't show up for her deposition, claiming at the last minute that she was sick, and eventually they just put in a judgment against her for way more money than the settlement amount. After they added up all of the money Lois got from her sister's accounts, or unauthorized payments made to others, and then fees and maybe some interest and legal costs, they ordered Lois to pay just over $100,000. If Lois didn't have $38,000, there was no way she had this. And of course, Dave was very upset about the entire situation. He was worried they might go after his business or whatever assets they jointly held. Lois was already putting a strain on the business because of her relationship with the employees. She was always kind to them, but according to the article The Pretender by John Rosengren and published in the Atavist magazine, Lois collected money from Dave's employees to get Dave a golf cart to use around the property. They all happily chipped in because Dave was a great boss and they were happy to help out. But then the golf cart never got purchased and Lois kept the money. According to the Dateline episode on the case, Dave found out Lois was asking other people for money, employees and friends in town, and he had to tell them to stop giving it to her. They were enabling her because through all of this, Lois kept going to the casino. John Rosengren, who wrote that article I referenced, The Pretender, he was also one of the talking heads on the documentary I'm Not a Monster, and he said something on the documentary that really hit the nail on the head. He said of gambling addicts, quote, "The person believes the disease is the only cure available," end quote. The only way for Lois to get out of this financial mess that her gambling got her into was to go to the casino and win the money back. And Lois said that it was in the time after the judgment against her, so we're talking 2017, that the marriage got really bad. She said Dave's anger towards her was at the highest it had ever been, and the verbal abuse escalated. And we do have a third party to confirm at least part of that. Dave was angry. Well, it doesn't sound like he was the kind of guy who went around venting his marital troubles to everyone. He said to a friend that he regretted getting home in time to save Lois's life on the day she overdosed. That's a really high level of resentment to have towards anyone, but particularly someone whose entire life is entwined with yours after 35 years of marriage. Dave ended up cutting Lois off entirely from any discretionary family funds due to her gambling, and if she wanted money, she had to get a job in town or work for the worm farm and get a paycheck. She would be doing one or the other at various points, though Lois said when she would try to hold down a job outside of Dave's business, he would make her quit. But in this time, Lois was supposed to be getting money to pay off this judgment. She never made a single payment towards it. Dave and Lois kept up a front to some degree with most of their friends and even their family. They still did all the family birthdays and holidays and events with their kids and grandkids, and they showed up to their grandkids' sporting events together. Very few people knew how bad their marriage had gotten. On Sunday, March 11th, 2018, one of their grandkids had a basketball tournament 2 hours away, so Dave and Lois drove out there for it, even though it meant spending 4 hours round trip in the car together when they weren't getting along. And to add to the tension, they got turned around on their way out there and showed up late. So late that they only got to watch the last bit of the game. Afterwards, Lois wanted to stay and spend some more time with the family, but Dave wanted to just turn right around and drive home. Some of the coverage of this case makes Dave sound pretty unreasonable here. I initially had the impression that Dave and Lois drove all the way out there. Dave would only let Lois stay for 15 minutes or so of the game, and then he made her leave early. He frankly sounded like a jerk. But that's only because a lot of the coverage leaves out the part about how they got lost on their drive out there. And when you think about it, Dave just didn't want to stay after the game. And you can imagine why. Dave was probably frustrated about the long drive only to not get to see the game. And maybe he wanted to get home at a decent hour because he worked the next day. So the two left after saying goodbye to everyone, and according to Lois, they argued for that 2-hour drive home. The next day, on Monday, March 12th, 2018, Lois went over to the business office on their property and told the employees that Dave was too sick to come to work. She needed someone else to handle running payroll, and the workers were concerned about Dave because Lois really seemed unlike her usual self. On Monday mornings, it would usually be, "How was your weekend? How's the family?" and so on. But there was none of that chit-chat. Lois barely looked at them, and so it seemed whatever Dave was sick with must be pretty heavy if she seemed that distracted and worried. When Dave didn't come to work for the rest of the week, Lois said on Thursday that he was going to go to the doctor on Friday to get checked out. Really, any illness that has you call out 4 days in a row with no end in sight needs to be looked at. Over the course of that week, when Dave wasn't going to work, he did talk to a few people, or rather, he texted with them. And if you notice that his texts seemed unlike him, as in, they were readable. Dave did not type well, particularly on a phone, so he liked to use talk to text. Back in 2018, when you used talk to text, you would have to state the punctuation mark you wanted to use. Like you would have to say, "How could you do this to me?" ? But Dave wouldn't do that. He would just talk in one long sentence to his phone and hit send. So people who got his text messages would normally have to read them aloud to decipher them. But during this week, the text messages people got were pretty easy to read because they included punctuation. Dave was sick for the whole week and the weekend, but Lois told his employees that thankfully the doctor cleared him to go to a big fishing tournament that he had been looking forward to. The actual tournament was on Thursday, March 22nd, but Dave and his friend were leaving on Tuesday the 20th to make the 5-hour drive. So everyone assumed that on Tuesday, Dave left. That was until Thursday when the foreman working at the worm farm saw Lois drive away from the house in Dave's Cadillac Escalade. That was the SUV he used to tow the boat. So that vehicle should have been with Dave at the fishing tournament. The foreman made a note of it, and then he decided to turn on the live stream from the fishing tournament that day. He watched as they called Dave and his fishing partner's names to present their catch, and only the partner stepped forward. It was clear then that Dave never went to that tournament, in spite of Lois telling people he did, and Dave confirming that's where he was through text. When Lois didn't come home on Thursday night, the foreman called in a welfare check on Dave on Friday, March 23rd. It had been 12 days since Dave was last seen at the basketball game. 2 officers went out to the house and knocked on the door. No one answered, so they did a perimeter check, and they only saw one thing out of place. A window was open. Where I live, March is early spring, but in Minnesota, it's late winter. It was below freezing, and there was still snow on the ground. There was no reason to have a window open. So one of the officers looked in. This was a window to a bathroom, and on the floor, he saw what looked like a body under a blanket. This was probable cause to make entry, so they went inside and found 54-year-old David Riess dead from multiple gunshot wounds. Dave had been shot in the arm in what looked like a defensive wound. He raised his arm up when someone pointed a gun at him. He was also shot in the chest and the back. Whoever did this, meaning Lois, we know Lois did it, so Lois had covered his body with the blanket, opened the window, and turned on the bathroom vent to avoid the smell of a dead body. And it was clear Dave had been there a while. Lois had shot and killed her husband and then lived in the house with his body for another week and a half. And after the police made entry into the home, no one saw Lois in town again. It looked like she was on the run. She did leave a short trail behind her. Lois had, unbeknownst to anyone, taken checks from the worm farm. She was not a signatory on the business, so she couldn't cash them directly. So instead, she deposited 2 of them into Dave's personal checking account, totaling around $10,000. And then she forged Dave's name to write checks to herself from that personal account in the amount of $11,000. 2 of those checks were cashed on March 23rd, the day Dave's body was found. The police then got a tip that Lois had been at her favorite casino, Diamond Joe, that same day, again, March 23rd. By the time the police got there, though, Lois and her winnings were gone. Between what she took and what she won, they estimated she had about $25,000 in cash on her, which could help her lay low for a while. So tracking her debit or credit cards wouldn't do much good in finding her when she had that much cash. In canvassing the area around the casino, they learned that Lois had gone to the convenience store next door at around 6:30 in the evening, and she bought a sandwich. She also had a conversation with the clerk that was caught on security camera. Lois asked him if she wanted to go south, and she got on I-35 south, would it take her out of state? Lois was not good with directions, so it may have been a genuine question. Maybe she didn't know that an interstate headed south would likely take you south to another state. But it was an odd enough question that they had to consider that Lois may have been trying to send the police in the wrong direction in the event the clerk ever spoke with the authorities. It seemed it could go either way, and if Lois was getting on I-35 and heading south, it wouldn't just take her to another state. It would eventually take her right down to Laredo and the Mexican border. To pursue Lois as a fugitive, they charged her with theft for stealing the money from Dave's account. They didn't charge her for murder just yet because they were still building a case. If they found her quickly and arrested her for murder, the right to a speedy trial clock would start, and they wanted more time to investigate. They thought that this warrant would be enough to have Lois picked up wherever they found her. Now, Lois was grandmotherly, she was disarming, so that would help her on the run, but they didn't think she would last long because she wasn't the most savvy person in the world. Or at least they didn't think she was. Not issuing a murder warrant would end up having a very serious unintended consequence, because Lois did pop up somewhere, but with only a theft charge from another state, the police weren't that incentivized to look for her. It was 10 days after Lois was last seen asking how to get out of state, on April 2nd, 2018, that a woman named Tess was cleaning her garage in Fort Myers Beach, Florida. Tess and her husband owned a car dealership in Blooming Prairie, Minnesota, but they spent their winters in Florida where they owned a few rental properties. Being business owners in Blooming Prairie, of course they knew Dave and Lois both professionally and socially. So they heard all the news from back home about how Dave had been murdered and Lois was on the run. But aside from mourning the loss of their friend and following the vague updates in the case, it wasn't really in the forefront of their minds down in Florida until that day Tess was down there cleaning out her garage. She saw a white Escalade pull up in front of her house and a woman got out. The woman had a piece of paper that she was looking at, so Tess stepped forward and said, "Can I help you?" thinking this was probably someone looking for a rental property. The woman looked up and Tess realized it was Lois. Lois just quickly said, wrong house, got into the SUV, and left. Tess ran inside to get her husband thinking they should go follow Lois, but he told her that was reckless. In the bolo for Lois, it said she was armed. So instead, they called 911. And they were surprised that the deputies in Florida didn't seem that concerned. They ran Lois's name, and she just had a warrant for a theft charge. If they found her, would Minnesota even bother extraditing her for a third-degree felony? Tess tried to tell them that Lois was also wanted in connection with her husband's murder, but she technically wasn't. She was just a named person of interest in the case. Besides, the deputies figured, since Lois had been spotted by someone who knew her, she was gone already. Fort Myers Beach is on a 6-mile-long island, and Tess lived right near the main bridge. It would make sense for Lois to just drive off and immediately take that bridge away from where she was spotted. It sounds like the police in Florida let Minnesota know that Lois was seen down there, and they did a few extra patrols of Tess's neighborhood, but not much else happened. Tess talked to her daughter back home, and her daughter said that a woman had called the family business in Blooming Prairie looking for Tess's address in Fort Myers Beach. It wasn't uncommon for Tess to invite friends down there for a visit, and she was also running a business renting out homes, so her address was hardly a well-guarded secret. So her daughter gave the woman the address, and while this caller didn't give her name, the caller ID showed the name Stormy Liberty, which was not anyone Tess knew. But put a pin in that name. Tess's theory is that Lois, who didn't know many people outside of Minnesota and certainly no one who would house a fugitive, went down there looking for one of Tess's rental properties in the hopes she could find an empty one that she could hide out in. Maybe she even hoped to stay in Tess's house since Tess and her husband were preparing to head back to Minnesota for the summer. But Tess saw Lois, and Lois had to pivot. And the assumption, on the part of the police, was that surely Lois pivoted off the island. But she hadn't. It turned out Lois stayed in Fort Myers Beach, and she even made a new friend, 59-year-old Pamela Hutchinson. Pam was initially from Virginia, but after her mother's death and then her own divorce, she moved to Bradenton, Florida for a fresh start. Pam had a fun personality and she was a deeply kind person, so she made friends quickly and easily. There was nothing Pam was lacking in Florida, so after renting for a few years, she was about to close on her own condo in the spring of 2018. While in the middle of that process, Pam decided to take a trip to Fort Myers Beach during the first week in April to be there for a friend. The friend's husband had died and they were scattering his ashes on a nearby island. Pam was hesitant to go only because of how expensive the room rates were, but another friend of hers was able to get her a discounted rate at a place where she, the friend, had a timeshare. So Pam, even though she was traveling alone and just looking for a regular hotel room, ended up with a 2-bedroom condo. And even though she went there for a somber occasion, Pam ended up having a good time in Fort Myers Beach. She had been enjoying the food and the social scene, and one of the people she met was Lois Riess. They met on Wednesday, April 4th, 2 days after Tess saw Lois at her house. Lois and Pam were both the type of people to strike up a conversation with anyone who got close enough, so it's not a surprise to anyone who knew either of them that they hit it off. Pam and Lois had dinner together that night, and then Pam, who planned to drive home on Thursday, April 5th, ended up extending her visit one more day. So she and Lois had dinner again on the 5th. Then on Friday morning, around 8:30, Pam called down to the front desk again and said that she was wondering if she could extend her visit all the way through to Monday. Someone had invited her to go boating that weekend and she really wanted to stay in town longer. She gave her credit card number to put the new charges on and everything was settled. Except staying through the weekend made no sense. As much fun as Pam might be having, she had cousins who were doing a road trip down to the Florida Keys, and they were supposed to stay with her that weekend on their way. Now, Pam was the type of person who might be late to something because she got caught up talking to someone, or maybe she'd double book dinner plans because she impulsively said yes to something. But not being home when her cousins were planning on spending the night, leaving them to figure it out at the last minute, was just not something Pam would do. Of course, when the cousins got to Pam's home and she wasn't there, they did try to call her to see what was going on, but Pam never answered. No one heard from her all weekend, not even her real estate agent who needed her to sign some things for her condo purchase. Then, Monday, April 9th came along and Pam was supposed to head home. And that's what the management at the complex thought she did. They were going room to room that morning to try to figure out the source of a water problem they were having. And when the manager got to Pam's room, she just let herself in because she thought Pam had checked out. But then she saw Pam's belongings in the living room, so she announced herself, but no one responded. As the manager made her way through the condo, she got to the primary bedroom and there was a musty smell. She figured she found the source of the water issue and she was more frustrated than anything else because she thought Pam hadn't told them about it. But when she went to open the bathroom door, she saw that there were towels on the floor along the bottom like you would do if you were trying to block a draft. The manager tried to open the door anyway, but something was blocking it. She left and found 2 men to come with her to try to get the door open, and by this point she wasn't frustrated anymore. She had a bad feeling about what they were going to find. And she was right. Inside the bathroom, covered in towels, was the body of 59-year-old Pam Hutchinson. She died from a single shot to the back that went through her heart, and there was a pillow from the bedroom in the bathroom. It had a bullet hole in it, like the killer tried to use it as a silencer. Pam's toothbrush was found in the sink, and they believe the killer came in as Pam was getting ready for bed and fired before she could even react. And that was the first sign. The killer was someone Pam knew. The front door would have been locked as soon as she closed it, and only someone with a key card could have gotten in. And Pam wouldn't be in the bathroom brushing her teeth if a complete stranger was around. The other clue that this was someone Pam knew was the extra room in the condo. Pam was staying alone, but the bathroom had used towels in it, and the bed had been slept in. So who did Pam have stay the night? The answer would come when they pulled the security footage, and it would show, as you've already guessed, it was Lois Riess. Security cameras at the complex would show that on Thursday, April 5th, Lois and Pam walked from the elevator to Pam's room around 7:45 p.m. Pam was never seen on CCTV again, but Lois sure was. Around 8:35, Lois left the room and stood out in the breezeway. Some commentators have said it looks like she's crying. She's definitely taking a few deep breaths, and I admit she looks a bit distraught and maybe even a little agitated. It is believed that this footage is from after she shot and killed Pam. And maybe Lois stepped out of the room because she couldn't believe what she had done again and needed fresh air to compose herself. Or maybe she was stepping outside to listen for sirens in case someone heard the muffled shot and called 911. If she was outside, she would hear the sirens earlier, and she would be able to get away faster. But no one reported hearing the shot, and Lois went back into the room after not quite 15 minutes. She then spent the night in the condo with Pam's body, and it was Lois, not Pam, who called to extend the stay for the weekend. This was to buy more time before the body was found. Lois then stole whatever she could reasonably take with her. Pam's credit cards, her ID, and even her sunglasses and hat. Lois was seen on security footage bringing items down to Pam's car and then moving things from her Escalade into that car. Lois was also seen on security cameras driving away in her Escalade, walking back to the parking lot, and then finally leaving in Pam's car. And the police already knew what happened to Lois's Escalade. It had been found just a mile down the road at a park the day before Pam's body was found. It just wasn't connected immediately. But by the time they found Pam's body on Monday, and they knew they were looking for someone with just a warrant for theft who was a person of interest in the murder of her husband and was now the prime suspect in the murder of Pam Hutchinson, Lois had a 3-day head start because this time, Lois was not sticking around town. And I just want to point out how absolutely brazen it was for Lois to be hanging out with Pam after Tess saw her. The area Pam was staying and the place Pam and Lois had dinner together was just a 5-minute walk from Tess's front door. Lois didn't just stay in the city, she hadn't even left the neighborhood. Had they looked for her, they probably would have found her before she found Pam. It was Tess who helped the police confirm that Lois Riess was the woman they were looking for. They had footage from various security cameras and showed Tess the images, and she said absolutely. That was Lois Riess with their murder victim. Pam Hutchinson was a savvy woman. She wasn't overly trusting of people, as kind and giving as she was. And I think that speaks to how non-threatening Lois came across. If you watch her interview for I Am Not a Monster, she really comes across as anybody's Midwestern grandma. I mean, I watched the interview after I knew what she did. And I almost wanted to believe her version of everything because why would this nice lady be lying to us? So when Pam heard about this poor widowed woman who was lonely and had just gotten into town, she told her don't bother getting a hotel room. Pam had a spare room in the condo she was already paying for. There was no reason to spend more money if she didn't have to. I don't live my life with the philosophy of trust no one, and I certainly wouldn't want this to be the message that you are getting from this episode, but I mean, this really does make a case for it. The investigators in Florida believed that this nice widowed lady purposely targeted Pam in order to steal her identity because they resembled each other. My favorite Dateline correspondent, Dennis Murphy, covered the case, and he didn't really buy that they looked enough alike that Lois targeted her for that reason. And it's possible she didn't, and Lois really just wanted money from her. You don't need to look like someone to use their credit cards. And while we can debate whether or not Lois thought she looked like Pam, I do want to say that they looked enough alike that Lois was able to go to the bank with Pam's ID to take out money from her accounts in larger amounts than she could get at an ATM. To do this, Lois pulled her hair back and wore Pam's hat, and it worked. I think if you take Pam's ID photo and you say maybe she did something different with her hair since the picture was taken, and, maybe she gained some weight, it happens to the best of us. And maybe Pam and Lois do look enough alike for Lois to have gotten $5,000 out of Pam's account from a bank in Fort Myers Beach, playing it so cool that she even made small talk with the teller during the transaction. And with that money, Lois was on the run again. She did leave yet another breadcrumb trail, and the investigators were following it, but like I said, she had a head start. On April 6th, the day after Pam was killed, Lois stayed at a hotel in Ocala, which is in north central Florida. She checked in using Pam's name, and I know whenever I've checked in, I've had to show an ID, so I assume she did that here, and we do know she paid with Pam's credit card. She even used the card for room service. Then Lois left the hotel on Saturday, April 7th, and went to an ATM where she took out $1,500 in 3 separate transactions. Lois then drove north for a bit before she headed west and popped up in a casino in Louisiana on Sunday, April 8th. And we know she was there because she won a jackpot, and she collected it under her own name. The question here is, why didn't she use Pam's identity again? Pam's body hadn't been found yet, and she had no reason to think it had been since she wasn't expected to check out until the next day. Maybe this shows Lois being sloppy or unsure what to do next, but I think it's possible she just didn't have anything with Pam's social security number on it, and she would have needed to provide that to collect her winnings since gambling winnings are taxable. But using her own name also meant Lois wasn't going to stick around for long. She tried to use an ATM to take out more money from Pam's account, but it declined, and she was back on the road. By 11 p.m. that same day, she was outside of Corpus Christi, Texas, and we know that because Pam's car plates were captured by an automatic license plate reader. And that is where the trail stopped. April 8th at 11:16 p.m. near Corpus Christi. Pam's body was found the next day, and when they started looking for Lois for the murder, Corpus Christi is where they hit their dead end. Lois didn't have an active passport, but she was getting herself closer to the Mexican border, so they alerted Border Patrol and the Mexican authorities. It was possible she was looking to find someone who might help her get across, and they knew Lois had some cash on her and maybe enough to pay for that help. There was also a real fear that once Lois ran out of the cash she got from Pam's accounts, She was basically going to be looking for another 50-something-year-old woman who she sort of resembled to kill and start using that identification to just continue to stay under the radar. Figuring Lois wouldn't want to risk heading back in the direction of Florida or Minnesota, they put up billboards in western states, in addition to billboards across Texas. And they got regular national news coverage on the case of the fugitive grandma, and that coverage ended up being how Lois was eventually caught. And because Lois was captured, we know where she went next. From that license plate reader near Corpus Christi, she continued on to South Padre Island. Coming from cold, landlocked Minnesota, Lois really liked her Gulf Coast islands. All I know of South Padre Island is that you can do primitive camping at the beach there, but that's not the part of the island Lois was interested in. She stayed on the south side where all the nightlife of the island was happening. Lois got a room at the local Motel 6 on April 9th, paying cash for the whole week, and she told the owners that she was hiding from an abusive ex. So they let her park her car behind the building. Instead of driving around in Pam's car with a bolo out for it, Lois walked around town or got rides with her new group of friends, because it took Lois just days to make friends. The motel she was staying at had a bar that shared the parking lot, and Lois headed over there one day. The owner introduced herself and asked Lois's name, and Lois said, Donna. And what the owner heard was La Donna. Lois was likely trying to just go by Donna, which is her mother's name, but now she was going by La Donna because of this slip-up. And that is how everyone in town knew her. They knew her as La Donna, and she said her husband had died and her family wasn't letting her grieve properly, so she was looking to start over elsewhere. She said she tried Florida, but it wasn't for her, so she was interested in getting a condo in Texas. Lois went to various places in town to eat, and she always asked to sit at the bar. She would then strike up a conversation with whoever sat next to her, and this is how she made friends, like with a woman named Bernadette. Bernadette was also a widow, and she felt for Lois, who she thought was trying to figure things out. They exchanged phone numbers and had dinner again another time. Bernadette later told the police that she ordered 2 drinks that night and couldn't even finish the second one because she got so woozy. It was like she was more intoxicated than usual for just 2 drinks. Even the bartender commented on it. Somehow, after these 2 drinks, Lois managed to get an invitation from Bernadette to go back to her house, and she even spent the night. They stayed up late talking, and one of the topics was the safety of Bernadette's neighborhood. Bernadette mentioned that there was one time when some guys were breaking into cars and driveways, and how the police ended up using her security cameras in their investigation. And Bernadette pointed out the inside and outside cameras she had because, as an older woman living alone, you just couldn't be too careful. And it's possible those cameras may have saved her life. Lois has not admitted to having any intention of hurting Bernadette, but between not feeling 100% after drinking with Lois and then heading back to the house, just like with Pam, I think it's possible Lois was at least considering her options here. But then she found out Bernadette's house was covered in cameras. The next morning, the 2 women went out to breakfast, and then Bernadette dropped Lois off at her motel with plans to meet up on Friday for dinner. Bernadette was not the only friend Lois made on the island. She would take pictures and even videos with her new friends. She even asked out the bartender at one of the places she went to. He said no. But really, for someone who was wanted in 2 states, she wasn't really trying that hard to be unnoticed. And that was a strange thing about this case. Why start making friends and make her presence known when her face is on billboards everywhere and on the news? The Meet Mary murder episode on the case had the only theory I've heard on this. It's that Lois was finally free to live the life she probably always wanted to live. There was no one to take care of except herself, no one to answer to. And that was worth the risk of getting caught. And that was how she got caught. On April 19th, Lois went into a restaurant and asked to be seated at the bar. She was told they didn't have a bar. They could get her a table instead, but she wasn't interested. The server suggested a place that shared the same parking lot, and she left. As soon as she did, the manager of the restaurant, George, said that woman was wanted for murder. He has said in interviews that he can't remember names, but he never forgets a face. He had seen her on a nationally broadcast morning show. He was taken aback because Lois certainly wasn't acting like she killed 2 people and was on the run. She actually told the server she was in the area to meet people, and that's why she wanted to sit at the bar, which seemed strange for a fugitive. George's coworker said there was no way that lady was wanted for murder, but he called the marshals anyway, and they were there in 15 minutes. Unlike with most of her traveling around the island, Lois had used Pam's car this time, and someone at the restaurant saw her get into it. The marshals very quickly set up a grid search to look for the vehicle, but they didn't make it very far. Lois had taken the restaurant's suggestion and just drove to the other side of the parking lot. She was sitting at the bar when the marshals entered, and they took her into custody without issue. Meanwhile, Lois's new friend Bernadette had no idea. She texted Lois to confirm their dinner plans and didn't hear back. When she called her, she got her voicemail, which surprised her because she knew Lois as LaDonna, but the message on the voicemail said that this was the phone of a woman named Stormy Liberty, the same name on the caller ID of the woman who was looking for Tessa's address in Florida. It turned out Lois had gotten a burner phone under that name. Bernadette didn't learn what happened until she showed up for the dinner plans, told the server she thought her friend was standing her up, and she was told about the arrest. After Lois was taken into custody, she wanted a lawyer and did not want to talk to the police except to know if her children knew she was alive. The investigators told her they hadn't spoken to them, but this was national news, and they likely saw it right along with the rest of the country. A search of Lois's hotel room uncovered 2 guns, including the likely murder weapon, and a go bag that had duct tape and latex gloves in it. They also found Pam's sunglasses wrapped in a white towel from the condo in Florida, and then assorted other items of Pam's like her hat, credit cards, and checkbook. Only $548 in cash was found, and to me that indicates Lois was low on funds by that point and possibly looking for another source for money. The evidence against Lois in both cases was overwhelming, and neither of these cases went to trial. Lois pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Pam Hutchinson in December of 2019 in exchange for a life without parole sentence. Prosecutors were initially seeking the death penalty. Lois didn't give much of a statement of fact in her hearings in Florida. She would later tell her story in her only interview, and we'll get into that in a minute. But to the disappointment of Pam's friends and family, there was really no explanation of what happened or why. Just that Lois admitted to murdering Pam, stealing her car, and stealing her money. Lois was then extradited to Minnesota to face charges there. She returned to Minnesota in July of 2020, and a month later, she took another plea deal. This was another life sentence, and they agreed that she would not be sent back to Florida to serve her sentence there. By being housed in Minnesota, she hoped that would mean visits with her children, should they want to see her, and any friends who stood by her, which turned out to be not many. The courthouse was too small to hold the sentencing with COVID-19 protocols in place, so they had to use the high school auditorium. Through questioning at the sentencing hearing, Lois did tell everyone what happened with Dave, or what happened according to her. She said that after the basketball game, they argued all the way home and continued arguing in the house. Dave went into his closet off of the bathroom, opened a dresser drawer, and pulled out the loaded gun. He held the gun out to Lois and told her to kill herself, saying, quote, "Do it right this time." Lois said she took the gun, looked at Dave's chest, and pointed it. She fired 2 or 3 times, and afterwards, she laid down with his body, closed his eyes, and then covered him with a blanket. Lois didn't say this at the sentencing hearing, but she later said that while she was still living at the house with Dave's body, she was losing track of time, and there were gaps in her memories. She said that she would just drive, and then eventually one day she drove herself all the way to Florida. And she claimed she didn't know why she went to Florida, even though we know she called Tessa's business to get her address there and showed up at that address. And that's the thing I kept having problems with when I was watching I Am Not a Monster. Lois had a lot of convenient gaps in memory. That's not a fault of the documentary. It was actually a pretty neutral portrayal. They interviewed Lois and let her tell her story her way, but then they had other people on camera who would more or less fact-check her. Lois plays the victim well, and in some instances in her life, she was the victim. And while she never claimed battered spouse syndrome in so many words, she basically said Dave's murder all came down to the culmination of Dave's abuse and her neglecting her own mental health while taking care of everyone else. As for Pam Hutchinson, Lois did speak on this in the documentary, but she wouldn't admit to much of anything other than that she killed her. She said she didn't plan to kill Pam, and she just had the gun on her because she had taken it with her from Minnesota. She said she remembered talking to Pam late into the night and that she had asked Pam to help her take her own life. But other than that, it was a puzzle to her why she shot Pam. She essentially blacked out. And this is where Lois completely loses me. She was blacking out so much, yet she knew to close the bathroom door and stuff towels under it to stop the smell, and to call the front desk to extend Pam's stay, and then move the stuff from her vehicle into Pam's, and then present herself at the bank as Pam to get money from Pam's account. She was functioning at a pretty high level, and I absolutely do not believe that Lois doesn't know why she killed Pam. Now, the reason doesn't make sense. Pam's life was definitely worth a lot more than a couple weeks on the run and a few more casino trips. But that is very likely the motive, and I don't know if Lois is lying to herself or lying to us, but I do believe she's lying. Lois said in her interview that she wished she went to trial and worked with the doctors, but she was afraid of dying in a mental hospital. But I have to say, there was absolutely no chance Lois would get a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict. She can say she was in a daze in the days after killing Dave all she wants, but she wasn't so much in a daze that she couldn't answer his text messages for him so that people thought he was still alive, or claim he was heading to a fishing tournament. She even thought to open the window so the smell of decomposition didn't bother her too much while she remained in the house. And she stole checks from his business, did multiple bank transactions to get that money, and then she took off. These are not the actions of someone who doesn't know what they did or doesn't appreciate the wrongfulness of it. Now, as critical as I am of Lois's interview, I will say she clearly does show remorse. And maybe it is shame that is keeping her from fully admitting what she chose to do. She has no chance at parole, so a parole board doesn't really care if she does the work here, but maybe if she worked on true accountability, life behind bars would be easier for her. As for the documentary as a whole, I really liked it. The title, I Am Not a Monster, tells us that they are going to explore the humanity of Lois Riess, which they did. They explained her childhood and gave information and education on gambling addictions, both of those things in much more depth than I got into here. There was one part of the documentary that I felt really tied things together. Towards the end, we learned that one of Lois's childhood friends still visits her in prison. She said she understands that most people won't because they see what Lois did as she puts it, a bridge too far. But her own father was a minister who visited people in prison, and that was probably the reason she still went. And I thought that was such a great choice for the director to leave that in. It's a small thing, but after showing how an unstable and unpredictable home life led Lois to making certain decisions, they also showed that her friend's childhood, where she saw the positive and loving example her father set, also influenced her decisions 40 years later. Of course, just because we can see the path that led someone to prison, Lois is where she deserves to be because she also had choices along that path. She had opportunities to get help, opportunities some people never get. Now, if you or someone you know struggles with a gambling addiction in the United States, you can call the National Problem Gambling Helpline at 1-800-522-4700. All calls are confidential. It is time for Patreon birthday shoutouts. I have to say, I know I sound a little different. I'm in a little bit of a portable makeshift situation. Right before I hit record, a motorcycle went by and I wished I was back in my studio. But I wanted to make sure I got these birthday shoutouts because I have 2 May birthdays I have to make up that I missed. So I want to say a very, very happy birthday to Ellie and Antoinette. I hope you had an incredible birthday month. And then a happy birthday to my June birthdays, Jennifer, Maggie, Paulina, Katerina, Claudia, Penny, and Michaela. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon, and I hope you're having an incredible birthday month. And from me to you, I want to say happy birthday.